Elementary Years at St. Mary's, Part 1. The year was 1970, and my mother told me that I, the youngest of her 5 children, would now have to start school that autumn, just like my brothers and sister had in years previous. Oh gosh, now it was my turn to go to school. There would be no more watching my TV favorites, The Flintstones or Sesame Street, over lunchtime in peace and quiet. There would be no more special time at home with only my granny and me while my siblings were away at school. Hence, when that early September 1970 day arrived, after the Labor Day long weekend, I was nudged out the door with my lunchbox in hand to go out to the street to wait for the school bus. Even though we lived only about a 10-minute walk from the school, we were mandated to take the bus to school because Martineau Street in Otter Lake, Quebec was a highway and way too dangerous for little ones to walk along it. So that morning, Mr. Laprise, a wonderful gentleman who lived outside the town, drove up with the little yellow school bus, and I climbed aboard. A few minutes later, after turning off Martineau Street, Mr. Laprise drove up and onto the semicircular paved drive of the schoolyard. He stopped directly in front of the doors of a massive red brick building that was St. Mary's Elementary School. I slowly descended the bus in shock and awe, completely amazed that nearly every child in Otter Lake was assembled here on the school grounds. I saw many kids I knew, and that helped ease my fear of going inside this massive building and starting my grade 1 studies that morning. We were allowed a little bit of catch-up time to chat with our fellow schoolmates, and I took the time to take in the surroundings at the front of the school. What amazed me the most was the tall statue on its cement pedestal of Christ the Sacred Heart with its arms raised to heaven. Surely, I thought to myself, this was a good sign. I would survive the first day of school. I thought about meeting my very first school teacher, but thought more importantly just then that this schoolyard was great because there were lots of grassy areas for relaxing and playtime. Suddenly, the sound of the bell from its belfry atop the school roof and its clang, clang, clang ordered us to line up to get ready to enter the red brick beast. As new students, we were met outside by our first grade teacher, Mrs. Louis Fleury. She had a warm smile, but we knew instantly that there was no fooling around with this lady. I wondered, could I escape and go back home? Nope, it was too late. So all the new grade 1 students and I assembled at the smaller of the 2 entrances to the school. The school had 2 entrances. The first was this one, the entry to the 1-story part of the school. The second entrance was larger, and if someone entered there, they would either go directly down a hallway to a large open space which serviced double duty as the school's auditorium and its cafeteria, or they would go upstairs to where the older grade 5 and 6 kids had classrooms. The first entrance, where I assembled with the other youngsters, is the one with big heavy doors. This entryway led to the area where the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade kids had classrooms in our school. Upon entering, as instructed by Mrs. Fleury, that we were to move slowly and quietly, we passed through the impressive entry hallway. It was scary, but because I was curious and was looking around a lot, I first noticed an enormous statue of, was it of Jesus, or was it of one of the saints? I pondered. In reality, I think it was a statue of the Sacred Heart. I was amazed at how shiny and clean the beautiful maple or perhaps oak wood floors were. To the right were some washrooms. I noted that both boys' and girls' washrooms were there on the right. As we moved slowly forward, a little further up in the hallway, we were instructed to turn left and turn down a second very long connecting hallway. This, in my mind, was the passage of many, many rows of endless classrooms. It seemed to go on forever and forever. As we were about to reach Mrs. Fleury's classroom, my thoughts drifted back to the washroom doors that I had seen. I imagined that the boys' room probably had urinals. I felt happy that I now knew where to find the bathrooms, should I ever have to avail myself later that day, but strangely I felt afraid of actually using a urinal. You see, at home we had a full bathroom, but we did not have a urinal. As such, I was not sure what a boy was to do when using a urinal. I assure you that in time I figured it out. One stands there and finds relief. Who knew these amazing inventions existed in this wonderful world, in this small town of ours? Mrs. Fleury's classroom was the first classroom on the left at the front of the school. This would be our classroom for the next 2 years, for both grades 1 and 2, but only if we did well and passed Mrs. Fleury's instructions. If we had not turned left towards Mrs. Fleury's classroom, we were told that if we had turned right at the junction, it would have led us to the interior entrance of the Grey Nuns, or the Sisters of St. Mary's Convent. Mrs. Fleury cautioned us to always be respectful to the sisters and not to bother them with our silly questions and nonsense. Being raised Catholic, I already knew and understood the important and sacred work performed by the sisters. Some of the Sisters of St. Mary's, nuns of the Sisters of Charity, were teachers, and they taught mostly the French-speaking children from Otter Lake. The others did community and charitable work for the church in the town. Mrs. Fleury was my mentor and my teacher for my first 2 years of primary school. She taught most all English kids from town at one point in history. I have very fond memories of her teaching us how to form our letters, how to write, how to spell, how to count, and how to add and subtract numbers. As well, there was always time for prayer and song, and on several occasions we performed crafts with the help of another teacher, Mrs. Grace Dale, during those 2 first years of school. If we behaved well, both in and out of class, and performed well in our studies, we would often be awarded with a star-shaped sticker placed in our notebooks or on special occasions. If a student was very good and worked well in his or her schoolwork, Mrs. Fleury would unlock her storage cupboard and take out the magic container of pink peppermints. One of the funniest memories I have from these first days of school was the mystery of the leaky lunchbox. At that time, our lunchboxes, including our thermoses of soup, juice, or milk, were kept directly behind the seats of our desks. Someone, and I forget who, did not tighten their thermos lid, and the soup or juice leaked out all over the floor. Everyone was curious to know where the liquid was coming from. The mystery liquid was mopped up, and to this day, no one really knows what transpired. Other happy times, as mentioned above, were enabling us, the first graders, to be creative with some arts and crafts during school time. 2 of the crafting events that come to mind now and are fondly remembered are when we constructed gifts for our mothers to be given to our respective moms on Mother's Day. We had glued a full paper plate and a half paper plate together to form a keepsake kind of paper basket. We then covered these baskets with paper flowers, cutouts, or string, and sometimes painted them to make them more personalized for our mothers. We were then instructed to make Mother's Day cards with customized messages for our moms. What a success Mother's Day was that year. At Christmas time, we created beautiful nativity figures to decorate our classroom. Mrs. Grace Dale came to our class once again to spend time with us to create 2 displays of the first Christmas. One was made to resemble stained glass windows. For this first one, all the characters of the nativity were formed with cutout pieces of cardboard, and the cutouts were then filled in with varied colored tissue paper to make the finished figures look like paper versions of stained glass windows. The cardboard pieces were trimmed to form images of Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, an angel, some shepherds, stable animals, the 3 wise men, and even a camel. These figures were then carefully cut to form geometric areas for our paper-stained glass pieces to be glued into. The cardboard formed the framing, and the tissue paper was our beautiful stained glass pieces. The other set of nativity characters was formed by completely covering the images of the manger in tiny paper bow ties made of colored crepe paper. These tiny bows were glued to the cardboard cutouts of the nativity characters. Blues were reserved for the Virgin Mary, brown and green for Saint Joseph, white and yellow for baby Jesus, etc. These nativity sets held prominent placement in our classroom windows throughout the Christmas season. Successfully, after 2 wonderful years under Mrs. Fleury's tutelage, we, the grade 2 pupils, graduated to grade 3. As grade 3 students, we had to move across the hall to a new classroom at the back of the school. For the next school year, we had to join the new grade 4 students who had just graduated from grade 3. To clarify, in the 1970s in our little town of Otter Lake, 2 school grades were taught by 1 teacher in the same classroom. Grades 1 and 2 were always together. Grades 3 and 4 were always together, and grades 5 and 6 were always grouped together. For now, however, with successful completion of both grades 1 and 2, my future school year of 1972-73 was yet to come. But first, summer break. Elementary years at St. Mary's, Part 2. By now, after having had 2 previous years' experience at St. Mary's, myself and the other seasoned school kids knew all the routines at the school. We knew the ins and outs of school life, the building, the schoolyard, and all the fun places to study, play, and hide. Of course, the very best place to hide was the magical janitor's closet. It was a tiny cupboard where the school bell rope hung in secret. This space was indeed one of these special hiding places. In September 1972, I started my grade 3 studies in Mrs. Grace Dale's class. It was a bit scary at first, because we left behind some of our younger former classmates in Mrs. Fleury's classroom and now joined the much more mature older group of the current school year's grade 4 students in this novel environment. Our studies continued, and the lessons got more difficult. We studied many things, but I mostly remember enhanced reading and writing, as well as arithmetic, or as I called it, oh gosh, more math. Not only were multiplication and division calculations added to the studies, but we started to learn decimals and fractions. We were also fortunate to have such a swell and knowledgeable and patient teacher. Poor Mrs. Dale, who had us, the inquisitive lot of pupils to manage. Actually, Mrs. Dale was friendly, warm, and caring, and always took the time to take away the pain to the brain when solving math problems. For me, math schoolwork most times that year was somewhat challenging, but the icing on the cake in grade 3 was that even more thinking would be required when the metric system was introduced in Canada, all across the country. Previously in Canada, we all used the imperial system just like the folks in England. Before any of us had started any formal schooling, the majority of us knew that a foot had 12 inches, a yard had 3 feet, 1 cup was 8 ounces, 10 miles was a long way to go, 90 degrees in the shade was hot, 32 degrees would freeze water in your toes, and a pound of fat was a heavy pound of fat. Well, in the early 1970s, Canada decided to adopt the metric system, and as such, we had a brand new curriculum to learn. This curriculum was implemented to help each of us best understand the distances, lengths, weights, masses, volumes, and temperatures of the future. As such, we got our introduction to the metric system in 1973 and 1974 at St. Mary's. In reality, most of us easily learned and adopted the metric system. It was fairly simple, as we all soon would understand that 1 millimeter times 10 was a centimeter, 10 centimeters times 10 was a decimeter, 10 decimeters times 10 made a hectometer, and 10 hectometers times 10 was 1 kilometer. Wow, tens, tens, tens across the board. It was the same for volume or liters and its derivatives, and the same for weight or kilograms and its derivatives. Temperatures as well were easy to understand with the Celsius temperature scale of the metric system in comparison to the older imperial Fahrenheit system. In the old days, temperatures had to be memorized because most were not standard. With Celsius, we soon learned that it was fairly easy because it was easy to remember that 0 degrees was the freezing point for water and 100 degrees was its boiling point. Simple, right? Anyhow, we were very fortunate to have once again our teacher and mentor, Mrs. Grace Dale, at our side. She was always there to help us assimilate the new and fun metric system. I remember her arriving to class with a variety of measurement tools, whether they were for weight, volume, temperature, or distance, and she would happily demonstrate to us the meaning of the measurements. Mrs. Dale and her well-thought-out learning techniques helped each of us in grade 3 or grade 4 to easily adopt the new metric system. It was all easy, easy, easy. But now it was time for us to teach our parents and to convince them that the metric system was the future for everyone. Well, we did our best. In addition to math and metric, we continued to have arts and crafts, and even some history and geography lessons were learned. It was in the 3rd grade that we had studied the map of Canada, learned the names of all 10 provinces, and most big city names of those provinces. Well, at least the capital city names. To help us with this learning, at the front of our classroom above the huge chalkboard was a window blind type roll-up map contraption. When pulled down into place, it displayed a most beautiful colored map of Canada. I remember each province and each territory having such vibrant colors. There was shading as well to show elevations like the Rocky Mountains and the Laurentian Shield. Beautiful hues of blue were used to show off the oceans that surrounded Canada. Just looking at this map and talking about the varied places in our country made each young student dream about perhaps visiting these places one day. I fortunately got to visit most of Canada's provinces and territories later on in life as a public servant supporting the Team Canada network. Everyday life at school, like before, had its daily routine. We started morning class, had our AM recess outside, then more class time, then lunch in the auditorium, followed by afternoon class, then our PM recess break, and finally the last bit of late afternoon class time before the bell rang to tell us to prepare ourselves for the bus ride or walk home. My favorite time, of course, while being in grade 3 was recess time. We were allowed to go outside and play in the schoolyard, which was a nice break from sitting in class. The girls usually played skipping rope games, girly ball games together, or giggled in groups because they liked this boy to that. The boys played baseball, wrestled, or played pirates or pioneer explorers of the Lost Fort adventures, when we would slide under and hide inside the wooden frame box of the Sisters of St. Mary's huge clothes stand, which was at the back of the school. The pressure was on, especially when we had to remain absolutely silent if one of the nuns was actually up there hanging their clothes to the line, and especially when the school bell rang calling us to return to class. Yikes. What to do? Get caught by Sister Mary Marth and get into big trouble, or get scolded by Mrs. Dale in class? Boys will be boys. Elementary years at St. Mary's Part 3. 1974 brought changes to St. Mary's Elementary School and our grade 4 class. Earlier in that school year, our teacher, Mrs. Dale, had an accident. She had broken her leg and would not be returning to school. Because this happened so long ago, I can't say with 100% certainty what type of accident Mrs. Dale actually had, but I do think that she broke her leg in an accident during a carnival snowmobile race. Of course, we were all concerned for Mrs. Dale, but we also all wondered, we would have a new teacher, but the question was who? We did get a new teacher, and as well a move to one of the mysterious upstairs classrooms, where only the older grades could go. Our new teacher started soon afterwards, and she was instantly loved by her students. Mrs. Paul Blasky was hired to teach us for the remainder of the year. She was a super great teacher and was lovingly known to her students as Mrs. T, based upon the first letter in her given name of Teresa. She was our beloved Mrs. Teresa Blasky. Grade 4 studies, as expected, intensified. This was no worry because time spent in class was a lot of fun. The good times happened because we had a whole new group of students. The former grade 2 pupils join us as the new grade 3 gang. This pairing of the two groups of students made for a year filled with lots of study and lots of adventure. Mrs. Blasky spent her days teaching us the required curriculum of reading, writing, geography, and math, now including long division, and we all did pretty well under her watchful eyes. I have happy memories of her also playing a piano that was in our classroom. This was a great time for music and song. Mrs. Blasky was also a great storyteller. We loved her history lessons. One of the more bizarre memories from grade 4 that I remember well is when I was no longer so shy and started to be more of a practical joker. Catching one of my younger grade 3 classmates alone in class one day over lunch break, I told her I was going to teach her a trick. She was game, so I said, why not? First, I told her to go over to the open window of the classroom, take both index fingers and put them into the sides of her mouth from the inside. Next, I then told her to stretch her cheeks slightly using her fingers within her mouth, and then to shout out the word puck, as in hockey puck. She was so happy to oblige, and the result was so funny that I tumbled laughing. You see, the word did not come out as puck with a stretched mouth. It sounded more like a not-so-nice word. Oh well, for a stupid kid, a practical joker, I thought it was pretty funny until we got caught by a teacher and the school principal. It seemed that some teachers were walking just outside the bank of windows when I had my fellow pupils scream this word loudly out for all to hear. Now, I knew what it felt like to get the ruler. I deserved it. That year was also a time when we celebrated Winter Carnival at school. If you grew up in Quebec, you knew all about Carnival. All children across the province knew about and looked forward to Winter Carnival each February. Carnival time was a fun period for kids and adults alike to celebrate winter. Carnival was filled with activities like the building and judging of snow sculptures, pancake breakfasts, dances, sports events, parades, and of course Monsieur Bonhomme Carnival himself. This particular year, we held a talent show at St. Mary's Elementary School as part of the festivities. This fun event was set up so that a few school children, who would be nominated by their peers, could win the contest and be crowned Carnival King or Carnival Queen. Oh, what fun! I was one of the lucky boys to be nominated to be Carnival King. So with help from my mother to make me a costume, and support and coaching from Mrs. Blasky, I was to perform as the singing cowboy. My mother, who was an excellent seamstress, planned out and sewed a wonderful blue cowboy shirt with red fringes for me. Equally, she said that if I took very good care of it, I could borrow my father's big white cowboy hat. Great. Now that I had a cowboy look, what would I do for the talent portion of the contest? After consulting with my grandmother, she thought I could sing well, so I selected a funny jingle I knew and started to practice it. My rendition of Pancho the Shooting Cowboy, sung to the tune of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, was now set to be my grand act. Of course, please understand that the 1970s was a very different time and kids would be kids. It was a time just after the 1960s, when Western television shows were still all the rage and cowboys were king. Today, this tune, similar to many of the cartoons we watched as children, are no longer appropriate, especially for children. Thankfully, most of us now have a much better understanding of the world and world issues. Nonetheless, for memory's sake, the first part of the tune went like this. Poncho, the shooting cowboy, had a very shiny gun. If you ever saw it, you'd just turn and run. All of the other cowboys used to laugh and call him names. They never let poor Poncho play any cowboy games. The rest of the song is lost to fade away in history. My fellow competitors performed other talents more amazing than mine. I remember singers, step dancers, poetry readers, and acting skits. I know for sure that it was not I who won the contest. My singing needed much more fine-tuning to be of any quality. I am still working at it today, but without much success. I do believe it was one of my most cherished classmates, cherished elementary school friends, who won due to her outstanding fast-footed step dancing. She was crowned Carnival Queen, and we all bowed to Her Royal Highness and celebrated her amazing win. Elementary Years at St. Mary's, Part 4. School years 1975, 76, and 1976. 77 would be the last 2 elementary years for me and the other children my age. Most of us by 1977 would have been 11 or 12 years old, and it was time for us to leave elementary school. However, though high school was on the horizon, we had had the privilege of going to school in our own town at St. Mary's. Later, studies at secondary school would be in Shawville, Quebec. That is the way schooling unfolded for all of the Pontiac communities in those days, and for most it is the same today. When starting elementary school back in 1970, there was a fair group of kids starting with me in grade 1. Over the years, we dwindled down to just 5 students in our grade level. Our grade 5 and grade 6 groups were comprised of only 5, 3 girls and 2 boys. Suddenly, when one of our buddies moved out to northwestern Ontario, we were just 4 from Otter Lake who graduated together at the end of our elementary school studies. Grade 5 and grade 6 activities, teaching, lessons, and support were provided to us primarily by a very seasoned, professional, and delightful teacher who was the amazing Mrs. Leona Corriveau. Mrs. Corriveau had been a teacher at St. Mary's for many years and was well respected and loved by her students. She was known as the leader in the upstairs classroom at the back. For these grades, we moved from our upstairs grade 4 classroom down the hall to the end and into the prized classroom at the back. Both grade 5 and 6th grade studies involved the usual required reading, writing, math, science, history, and ecology subject lessons with the increased challenges required for each respective grade. I have good memories of having to read out loud to the class and having to write poems and short stories under the critical editor's eye review of Mrs. Corriveau. She was always there to support and guide us through our studies, and to my memory, because of her and her talents as a teacher, our studies went quickly and easily for both grades 5 and 6. We also had one other teacher for part of our studies in grades 5 and 6. For most of us Anglophone children growing up in an English-speaking family, it was now time to ensure that we too, the English kids of Otter Lake, could also understand and speak French. A wonderful gentleman called Monsieur Charles would join us a few times a week to give us French lessons. We learned lots of grammar and spelling and pronunciation for French words, sayings, and short phrases or stories. This wonderful teacher was very patient with us and supported us on our road to becoming bilingual. Some of the highlights and funny memories I have of being in the classroom at the back involve typical childhood behaviors and exploration. On one occasion during our lunch break, a fellow student and I sneaked back into the school, moved quietly up the stairs without being detected by any of the sisters or Madame Cartier, the lunch monitor. Sneaking in was a tricky adventure, because one had to pass the teacher's room, which was right off the school's entrance to its auditorium at the bottom of the staircase. There were always teachers in that room eating their lunch at noon, and there were always nuns surveying the downstairs hallway that joined the entryway to the stairs. Of course, the other option was to sneak in through the auditorium's back door and slink through the cafeteria area, where one could better avoid the teacher's room. Not on this day, however, because that back door was locked. Anyhow, on this day, my schoolmate and I were successful in getting upstairs and to the back classroom. We really did not want to make any mischief. We just wanted to explore the book and supply closet and rearrange its contents to help Mrs. Corriveau keep things organized. Instead, we spotted her pack of cigarettes on the desk and matches to light one up as well. Yes, back in those days, some teachers smoked, and cigarettes could be left without issue. We all know better today. Well, what would two curious kids do? We decided to sneak one and try it. To avoid detection from a smoked-up classroom, we intelligently opened up a window, took one cigarette out of the pack, and while hanging our heads outside, lit it up. We coughed and sputtered and felt ill. To make things worse for me, the confounded cigarette tasted mint because they were menthol. I hated mint. At that time, I despised mint. Now that the cigarette was lit, we were not sure what to do with it. How would we dispose of a lit cigarette without anyone finding it? Well, the only thing to do, of course, was to finish smoking it. Upon finishing it, we threw the smudged out butt out the window. We had hoped we would go and bury it in the sand later that day. We then swished the smoke as much as we could out the windows, and I do believe that we did not get caught. Well, that is how I remember it. I am sure, however, due to her eagle-eye glances at me all that afternoon, Mrs. Corriveau knew. Throughout all 6 grades of our elementary school year education, some sort of physical activity was always encouraged by the teachers. Definitely, there were always 2 outdoor recess breaks, both morning and afternoon, and at least 30 to 40 minutes of being outdoors each day after having eaten our lunches. Our lunches were eaten sitting at 2 rows of long tables in the cafeteria. Once we swallowed down our food and cleaned up the tables, off we would go to play outside. Often the younger kids would gather naturally to play games of tag or hide and seek or hopscotch. The girls would partake in skipping rope and the boys would play ball games. Like mentioned in part 3 above, some boys would bring their Hot Wheels toy cars to school, and all young lads and some of the girls would gather around to play with our tiny cars, racing them quickly down the little roads we made in the sand at the back of the school. In both grades 5 and 6, more formal physical education was introduced to us. A physical education teacher, Mr. Pierre, was hired to help us be more active and to introduce us to the rules of popular sports like hockey, basketball, baseball, and soccer. I believe he was an athlete, but I cannot remember this detail accurately. However, he was muscularly fit and could have been an athlete. I know, though, that he was instrumental in making sure our little school in Otter Lake could partake in and enjoy the World Olympics as much as any other Canadian or world citizen would. The year was 1976, and Montreal, Quebec was the place to be in order to see, with one's own eyes, the spectacular games called the Olympics. Mr. Pierre understood that most of us at St. Mary's could only dream of a trip to Montreal, so he instead worked with the other teachers to hold our very own Olympic Games. Mr. Pierre taught us all about summer Olympic sports like the high jump, the shot put, the javelin, the discs, the 25-meter race, the long jump, the hurdles, etc. We learned excitedly about the origins of the Olympic Games and the significance of the Olympic rings. On the day of our mock Olympics, there were no classes that day. Yeah, screamed all the kids. We spent one whole day outside competing in these Olympic events, and we all proudly applauded our winners at our very own gold, silver, and bronze medal ceremony. How well did I do, you may ask, at our little Olympic Games? Sadly, there was no medal for 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th place, so as a result, my feet never left the ground to climb the podium, nor did any medal adorn my neck. Well, that is the end of this story. I completed my elementary school years at the beginning of the summer of 1977 and said goodbye for the final time to St. Mary's Elementary School. The next chapter of life would be high school, or as it is called in Quebec, secondary school. We knew already that our studies would continue in Shawville, Quebec at Victoria Avenue High School, or VAHS, but not yet first summer break.